After hearing the Ten Commandments, what did Israel request of God? This is the question that we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of Deuteronomy on Walking Through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
If you have a Bible with you, you can turn to Deuteronomy chapter 5. We're going to be reading from verses 23 to 33. If you don't have a Bible, don't worry. Just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So Deuteronomy chapter 5, beginning at verse 23. So it was, when you heard the voice from the midst of the darkness, while the mountain was burning with fire, that you came near to me, all the head of your tribes and your elders. And you said, Surely the Lord our God has shown us his glory and his greatness, and we have heard his voice from the midst of the fire. We have seen this day that God speaks with man, yet he still lives. Now therefore, why should we die? For this great fire will consume us. If we hear the voice of the Lord our God any more, then we shall die. For who is there of all flesh who has heard the voice of the living God speaking from the midst of the fire, as we have, and lived? You go near and hear all that the Lord our God may say, and tell us all that the Lord our God says to you, and we will hear and do it. Then the Lord heard the voice of your words which you spoke to me, and the Lord said to me, I have heard the voice of the words of the people which they have spoken to you. They are right in all that they have spoken. Oh, that they had such a heart in them, that they would fear me and always keep all my commandments, that it might be well with them and with their children forever. Go and say to them, Return to your tents. But as for you, stand here by me, and I will speak to you all the commandments, the statutes, and the judgments which you shall teach them, that they may observe them in the land which I am giving them to possess. Therefore you shall be careful to do as the Lord your God has commanded you. You shall not turn aside to the right hand or to the left. You shall walk in all the ways which the Lord your God has commanded you, that you may live, and that it may be well with you, and that you may prolong your days in the land which you shall possess. In this chapter, we have been discussing Moses' retelling of the Old Covenant law God made with Israel, beginning with the Ten Commandments. We found that Israel was to worship no other gods. They weren't to make idols even of Jehovah. They weren't to take the name of the Lord God in vain or use it carelessly. They were to keep the Sabbath, rest on the seventh day of the week. They were to honor their father and mother. They weren't to murder, commit adultery, steal, bear false witness against their neighbor, or covet anything that was their neighbor's. We noted that 9 of these 10 commandments have always been part of God's law, with the 4th commandment, physically keeping the Sabbath, as being unique to the law of Moses. We do not find the physical keeping of this commandment repeated under Christ, so Christians aren't bound by it. Coming to verses 23 through the end of the chapter, we have repeated for us the aftermath of God giving Israel the 10 Commandments, which was discussed in Exodus 20:18-21. It must have been a sight to see, hearing God's voice thundering from the mountain that was burning with fire. Israel thought so, for they said that God had surely shown them his glory and his greatness by doing so. However, as we know from other scriptures, including Exodus 33:22, God's true glory was still shielded from Israel, even here, for had they seen it, they would have died. What they did see was magnificent for sure, but it will only be through Christ, come the judgment day, that we will finally see God as he is and be able to worship him in his immediate presence. By speaking to them from the mountain, though, Israel did learn a lesson about God that had been a misconception about him from all the way back in Genesis, which was if God spoke to someone, they would die. That turned out not to be true. But even with this being the case, Israel was still afraid that if God continued to speak directly to them, that they would die. Why? Perhaps they thought that they would do something that would make God angry, and he would simply consume them. We don't know entirely, but their request was that God speak directly to Moses, who would then relay God's commands to Israel. God accepted Israel's request of using a mediator, so Moses acted as Israel's mediator between them and God, just as Jesus acts as our mediator between us and God today. In agreeing to a mediator, God is praising Israel for their attitude about God's holiness, but laments that he wished that they had a heart that would always fear him and keep his commandments. For God knew Israel. He knew of their stiff-necked ways and their proclivity of going off and serving idols. He thus knew that he would be grieved with them, even though they were hallowing him at that moment. Israel was then commanded to go to their tents, while God gave Moses the rest of what would become the law of Moses. Moses was to teach Israel this law, so that they may not only observe the commandments of the Lord, in other words, know what the commandments are, but that they actually do them. This shows us that true faith in God is not merely believing what God commands, but actually doing what God commands. If Israel observed and did what God had commanded, they would prosper in the land of Canaan. However, if they didn't, God would punish them. In our next lesson, we'll deal with what Jesus told the lawyer in Matthew 22:37, which was the greatest commandment of all. So we hope you'll return for that lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 1 to 9, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time.
Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.